Today we are going to talk about the climatic conditions in Minnesota, the past, the present, and the future. So the main points that we'll cover are that Minnesota has become and is becoming wetter and warmer. We've seen more precipitation across the year, but we've also seen heavier and more frequent downpours. We've seen warmer nights and also warmer winters, and we've had lesser and, in other words, we've had less extreme, really cold conditions. And we've also seen an interesting late winter pattern emerge that I will call a boom or bust pattern. And we'll talk about that as we get to that point. Another thing is more changes are coming. Climate is going to continue changing, but even as it changes, there's going to be normal ups and downs, normal variations in our year to year and even month to month weather. So we should expect those variations, and we should also expect to be surprised at times. And of course, folks in this audience want to know, well, what about 2021's fieldwork season? What about the early growing season? I'll try and give you the sense of what it is that we're watching. But I can tell you that we had a really warm winter. We have been pretty dry. We've had a warm winter through January, but as everybody knows, it really changed and we did a U-turn. And there's some questions about what that means for the remainder of winter, for the early spring, and for the early growing season. All right, so let's talk about how we've become warmer and wetter already. Really, there's been a dramatic shift towards wet and warm conditions over the past few decades. This graph shows annual combined temperature and precipitation averaged across Minnesota. And those axes in the middle are the 20th century averages. So you can see, if you can read those axes, they say, the warmer years are going to the right and the wetter years are going up. So if you see any year that's in the upper right quadrant there, that would be a warm and wet year relative to the 20th century averages. Well, a bunch of things might jump out at you. One is, for the most part, this has been a fairly symmetrical pattern of temperature and precipitation over the historical record. You can see that 2019 was the wettest year, although it wasn't particularly warm. But you also see a number of those years in the far upper right reaches of this graph, indicating the combined warmest and wettest years on record. And note that all of them, these are the top 10 combined wettest and warmest years on record. They were all from 1998 onward. And you see, so it's really been this kind of dramatic shift towards wetter and warmer conditions. Now, we could have done this in any of a number of ways, and this graph would be valid even if we included the entire state of Minnesota. It would just have a slightly different set of numbers. But on the left, what you see is, for that multi-county area that I have selected, that first graph shows annual precipitation. We hit an all-time high in 2019, averaged over this region, and you can see the 7-year moving average through time. On the right, you see the same thing. It's annual average precipitation, but it's averaged by decade. So if you put the two together, precipitation was higher in 2019 than any other year on record back to 1895, and the 2010s were the wettest decade on record, going back to the 1890s. And so it wasn't just that 2019 was exceptionally wet. It was that there were other years in the 2010s that were quite wet also. It's not just the precipitation, it's also been heavy precipitation. If we take the 39 long-term stations that we have, and if we take the 39 long-term stations and look at how many 3-inch daily rainfalls we've had, there's actually been about a 60% increase in the frequency of 3-inch daily rains in Minnesota. So a typical place now averages about one every year and a half or so, depending on how, maybe 1 to 2 years on average. But it used to be it maybe took 4 or 5 years in between 3-inch daily rainfalls at an average Minnesota location. So there's been a 60% increase in the frequency of these. When you get 3 inches of rain, that's typically the entry level for flash flooding. Not every time will you see flooding, but certainly in normal conditions, or if it's been wet, then 3 inches of precipitation is going to cause extra runoff, erosion, problems like that. Um, when it's been really dry, then you don't see the same issues. But of course, we've been in a very wet period. So when you combine the wet period with increased frequencies of these 3-inch rainfalls, you can infer from that more problems from flooding. We also see an increase in the size of the heaviest rainfall of the year. That's the graph on the right. Again, just using those 39 long-term stations. So we haven't increased the number of stations at all. We've held that constant. And what you see is it's not every year. We're not saying that every year the heaviest rain is heavier than the year before, but with increasing frequency, we are seeing years that were unlike anything we had observed previously. So when you put it all together, we're seeing more precipitation across the year. We're seeing more days where there's heavy precipitation. And then we're also seeing a general increase in the size of the heaviest precipitation event. Now, when we look at something different, how our temperature has changed in Minnesota, one trend should jump out immediately, which is that Minnesota's northern areas have warmed faster than Minnesota's southern areas. Um, but another thing that should jump out at you is that winter, especially those winter lows, a typical night in winter is now 5 to 7 degrees warmer than it would have been, say, around the turn of the 20th century. That is a substantial warming. And then when we look at a typical summertime high temperature, well, that's not that different. We've warmed a little bit on average, mostly in central and northern Minnesota, but you see summertime highs have actually been declining in southern Minnesota. So the main warming trend that we've seen has been for the warming to increase with northward extent and for winter to be warming faster than summer. When we look at the way winter has warmed, and now we're going to look at kind of an extended winter that goes from November through March, and it's just going to include that multi-county area. But again, this would be valid for the majority of for all of Minnesota and the majority of the region. We can see wintertime average temperatures have warmed by almost 4 degrees in the last 5 decades or so. That's a dramatic warming. And you can see that in the last several decades, we've had some of the very warmest winters on record, including the warmest, but also several that are in contention, and certainly in the top 10. So a lot of winter warming, and this is where we've seen a lot of our changes. So just keep in mind kind of the bigger picture, which is that we've gotten wetter, we've gotten warmer, and now we're talking about how we've gotten warmer. And a lot of it has been because of changing winter conditions. We've also seen fewer and less severe winter cold temperature or low temperature extremes. So this graph is out in Milan in western Minnesota, not too far from the Minnesota River. And it's an old rural measurement site. And the graph shows both the lowest single temperature each winter and then also the average of the 15 lowest temperatures of each winter. And what you see in both cases, those values are going up and have been going up with time. Now, of course, note that they don't go up following a straight line, but they have their ups and downs along the way. But if you look at that dot that's circled in 2019, you see a low of -33. That was probably January 29th or 30th in 2019. And that was an extremely low temperature. But look to the left on that graph and you see how common this used to be. So basically what we say is current cold extremes used to be more common. And what used to be considered extremely cold, that's now something that no longer occurs. Again, we see this across the state. It's not just at Milan. It's not just in the Twin Cities. It's at Morris and Waseca. It's pretty much everywhere. So you could think of winter as warming a lot. And you might assume that that means, well, then there's less snow and there's less days with snow cover. But this is an important consideration. What I've done here is I've got a graph of the late winter snowfall. So February, really right through May, for the from 2000 through 2020. And what you can see is pretty typical variability. You have a lot of kind of normal looking years and you have some really big years. But I want to point out that the years that I've circled here were years where the late winter snow was pretty close to what you'd expect, maybe a little bit low even, and we ended up with really good planting and early growing season conditions. And that's what you want to see. But then look at these years. So again, winter has warmed a lot. We're seeing a lot of warming in winter, and but when you combine the fact that our temperatures or our climate varies somewhat regularly, has these ups and downs that are built into it, with the fact that we've had more moisture, every once in a while, it's led to late winter conditions that are really difficult and lead to poor planting and poor early growing season conditions. So 2013, 14, 18, and 19 all had extended periods of cold and really high snowfall totals in most of southern and central and western Minnesota. And these led to delays and some significant problems at times from for the early growing season. So, for example, 2019 was famously delayed, and many farmers decided they wouldn't even get into the fields at all. And 2018, we were doing okay, but we were hit by a mid-April blizzard that set everything back a couple weeks. And we had similar issues in 2013, where we had ice storms in southwestern Minnesota in April, and then heavy snows throughout southern and western Minnesota for much of the remainder of the month. It caused major delays getting into the field. So when we talk about this, that's we should really keep our eyes on this thing called the polar vortex. I'm sure you've heard of it because it's been a popular term, but it actually has meaning for what we were just discussing. So polar vortex disruptions are known to trigger severe winter weather outbreaks. And the most famous examples were 2014 and 19, when we had extremes of cold that got everybody talking. But for agricultural purposes and for a lot of land management purposes, I'd say polar vortex outbreaks are more notable for producing prolonged late season snowy periods. Even if you don't have the extreme cold, these polar vortex disruptions can leave you in a somewhat cold air mass that is also conducive to producing a lot of the weather systems that lead to snow and heavy snow. And so we had 4 such events, and they all produced lots of late season snowfall. And at least 3 of those instances were problematic for farmers. I believe all 4 were. So the reason this matters is because when we talk about the current and near-term conditions, we have to include 2021. We had a really warm winter right up through January, and then things have changed. And as I'm recording this, the temperatures in Minnesota are struggling to get above zero, and most of you are familiar with this. And by the time you see it, it will have been several days in on a prolonged cold outbreak. And the question is really, where does that lead us from here? These polar vortex disruptions are normal parts of our climate. They're normal variations that you should expect, even though we're extremely confident that warming winter trends are going to continue. When we look at what we expect for the long future, as we get into the middle of the century, the projections tell us to expect more precipitation, more heavy precipitation, which is the map that I'm showing here on the left. I wouldn't read too much into the detail, but the big picture is that you're going to get an additional day or so per year with what we now think of as heavy precipitation. We're also going to continue seeing shorter frost seasons, longer growing seasons, warmer winters. And then on the right, we also indicate that even though summertime high temperatures have not increased very much in Minnesota at all, by the time we get to the middle of the century, even using the lower emissions pathway, we would expect more days of, say, 90 degrees. And it's in some cases significantly more days hitting 90 degrees in southwestern Minnesota. So that's kind of what the climate models tell us to expect. But you should also expect variations and surprises as we go forward. Typical ups and downs that are just part of our climate, those are going to be superimposed over the trends that we are expecting, the ones that we're also already experiencing. For example, even as we have wet decades like the 2010s, there were dry periods embedded within that. 2012 was very dry. We had almost knockout drought in southwestern Minnesota in 2012. But even during drought periods, you can have floods. You can have cold extremes during warm winters like we're seeing this year. And just one example of how this all happens, you could think of the Winthrop area in Sibley County, which was, that's in kind of south central, southwestern Minnesota, southwest of the Twin Cities. And that area was hit hard twice over the summer by intense rainfall events. One of those rainfall events produced 11 inches of rain in Winthrop, and the other one produced about 8 inches. But this is inside of a developing drought condition. The summer of 2020 was not a blockbuster wet summer that like we had seen in previous years. It was actually mostly dry, but then was punctuated by some heavy rainfall events. So in this case, the impacts were kept at bay. But it's important to note that you can be wet, predominantly wet, and then have a dry condition emerge within that. But then even within dry conditions, you can get a flood. We could get drought and still have intense precipitation. And I'm sure everybody in the audience can think of times where something like that has happened, where it's been, you've been getting warm winters, but you still get blizzards, or you still get extreme cold, or you're in the midst of a drought and you still get dumped on. These are the kinds of surprises and variations we should expect from our climate. And so now when we talk about the expected early growing season conditions, we can't tell you exactly what's going to happen, but I'll tell you what we're watching in the climate office and what I'm watching personally. I guess the most important story is it has been dry. This is a map from February 2nd of the U.S. Drought Monitor for Minnesota, and you see that the entire state is now at least abnormally dry, and you have some drought in the corners. There are no significant impacts that we know of yet, and of course, winter is a relatively safe time to be in drought conditions, but this carries over from the dry conditions we had in 2020. If the dry conditions continue, then we have to expect depleted soil moisture, more summertime heat stress because there's just less water available to help reduce some of that stress, and even possible water shortages. So it's actually a critical time. And what happens February, March, April, and into May is going to be really important in determining the outcome here. We are going to know a lot. If we were to revisit this discussion in early May, I guarantee this map would look differently in some way. It would either have more yellow and more reds and browns on it, or it would have less because we got wet. So it's a really critical time. And when we look at the Climate Prediction Center outlook, this is February, March, and April. And I want to caution you that these forecasts were made at the middle to the end of January, around the 21st. And at that time, there was no polar vortex on the horizon, and there was no major cold outbreak. So the forecasters were pretty confident that on balance, Minnesota would spend the next 3 months being warmer than normal, and that maybe we'd be in a normal to slightly wetter than normal pattern, depending on what part of the state you're in. But the big question is, does the warm winter prevail, or have we flipped? Because if we flipped and we remain cold, and it's not just this 1 to 2 week outbreak of cold, but we remain in a cold state through February and through March and into April, then we should expect to be snowy or at least wet during that time also. Now, the benefit of that is that would slow down this drought that seems to be building in Minnesota. It maybe would even reverse it. Obviously, the drawback of that is it could also slow down spring field work. I mean, nobody wants to get in late again. Nobody wants another situation where they can't get into the fields in May. But it's something we have to look at least as being on the table, that once you flip into a colder pattern, sometimes it's hard to get all the way out of it. And during that, you could end up with quite a lot of snow. So to summarize where we've been today and what we've talked about, Minnesota is already wetter and warmer, with more precipitation and more precipitation extremes, warmer winters, and also warmer nights. Late winters, as we've discussed, the period is kind of critical for this audience, that period getting into the main runoff season in spring. late winters have been anything but consistent. Remember, we've had that boom bust pattern where you get a lot of good late winter conditions. I mean, I think of 2015, 16, 17, where there was no snow on the ground. Things were looking pretty good as you got into April. And then you could also think of 2018 and 19, where it was almost unusable. Uh, the projections looking in the years and decades ahead, especially when we get into mid-century, indicate more precipitation, more warming, and even some hotter summers too. And again, we haven't really seen those hotter summers yet. So that's going to be a shock to the system once we do start seeing those. However, even with those trends, you have to remember it's not a straight path there. We should expect ups and downs along the way, including extreme ones. That's just going to remain part of our climate. So even as we get wetter and warmer than we have been, you can expect dry periods, drought, and cold spells. And you should always expect surprises that interrupt whatever the dominant climate regime of the time is. And for spring 2021, we're wondering which one's going to win out. Is it going to be the cold, or is it going to be the predominant warmth? And what's going to happen to that developing statewide drought? So I thank you so much for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. My name is Kenny Blumenfeld. You can see me at this email address below, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.